Until quite recently, China was considered a developing country. And in some respects, it still is, although it tends to be classified now as a quote-unquote middle-income country. But what I want to ask about in this segment is to what extent, as China becomes wealthier and more ambitious globally, does it begin to play a role not as a developing country, but as an actor in the developing world and as a potential supplier of investment and aid and so on. So what are the implications of the rise of China? Well, one of the things we should point out to is, and I don't think this gets enough attention, in terms of poor people not being poor anymore, the rise of China is a spectacular success for the international market and for the market in general, right? The numbers are rough numbers, but something like 600 million people have been lifted out of poverty in China in the last 25 years or so. Now, there are those who can argue, and I think there's a good case to be made, that at least some of that raising of 600 million people out of poverty in China have come at the expense of manufacturing jobs in other countries. So one of the interesting questions to get at is, to what extent is that a zero-sum game? That's the argument that economic nationalists make, or what we would call neo-mercantilists or realists. The other really interesting question about the rise of China economically is as the Chinese get wealthier, China gets more wealthy as a country, and that augments Chinese power to the point where there are now a lot of people who don't want to see China develop more economically because they're worried about the implications for the role that China might play in the world. But what we really want to focus on is China and the developing world. And to give a sense of China's ambition, I just have a couple of maps here. The one on the left about the Silk Road refers to this project that the Chinese have called the Belt and Road Initiative. And the road part of it refers to really trying to rebuild a trade infrastructure across from China, across Central Asia, through Russia, and through Iran and Turkey into Western Europe. When they call it the road, because it's meant to invoke the medieval era Silk Road that had trade going back and forth between China and Europe. But what this really means is pipelines, rail lines, highways. The second part of this is what they're calling the Belt, which is entirely new, but essentially is an effort to build port facilities around the world that are built by Chinese companies as a way of supporting the role for Chinese exports and imports of raw materials. And so you see these black dots on this map are sort of all the places around the world where the Chinese government or Chinese government companies are investing in port infrastructure. So it's really a quite ambitious augmentation of Chinese economic activity. The map on the right points particularly to Africa, because Africa is a place where China has seen a lot of opportunity, in part because it's so poor and therefore so much in need of aid, but also there's a lot of sense that Africa is the last great untapped economic a market, but also a potential contributor to economics in the world. And it's kind of ironic that at the end of the 19th century, there was also this notion that Africa was the last best thing left, and that led to a huge colonial rush in Africa. But basically, this map's a little bit out of date. This shows investment between 2000 and 2011. It's the best map I could get of Chinese investments. So that's a sense of the scale and the scope of Chinese involvement. The questions are, what do we think about this? Is this a helpful alternative to Western-led aid and investment? Does it give African, if we just focus on Africa now, does it give those governments more options to sort of choose the deal that's best for them? What's the impact on labor in those places? Is it providing lots of people with lots of well-paying jobs? Or does it actually simply help the authoritarians of China, the authoritarians of Africa, by allowing them to get aid from a country that doesn't really care how democratic they are? And then the question is, what kind of strings are attached? There's a lot of people who are going to argue that this is not just economic investment by China, that these projects, the money is generally not donated, it is lent, some of the same kinds of charges that have made over Western aid in the past, and that really what this is an effort to do is to make these countries and their governments indebted to China and therefore dependent on China in the future. So it's really seen as a much more of a global geopolitical power play. I think it's hard to say in the abstract for the time being exactly which of those views is the most valid. But there's another respect in which China creates a problem for what I've called the late developers. The idea being, right, that England developed first, Germany and France and the United States kind of had to cope with England. That is, when they were developing, they had to competition from England. Then there's another round of countries that came after them, kind of in the 20th century. Well, now you get these late developers. This is discussed more in the book. Typically, whether we talk about the Asian tigers or we talk about some other countries, one of the ways in which newly developing countries have competed in the international market has been to rely on cheap labor to drive imports. People who are poorer can increase their standard of living while still being relatively cheap compared to labor in more developed countries. And so cheap labor has really been used to drive exports. Moreover, as in the case of the Asian tigers, right, this developmental state. The question now is how do you deal with a country with a gigantic economy, because it's got 1 billion people in it, very cheap labor, increasingly advanced technology, and a very strong state, right? In other words, if you're some country in Africa or even in Southeast Asia, how do you compete in export markets? How are you going to sell things in the United States that beat what's coming from China on either price or quality? It seems like it's really, really hard to do. And in that respect, there's a fear that export-led growth is going to become a less viable strategy now than it maybe was in the middle or the late 20th century. One of the hopes for some of these late developers is actually in Chinese economic development. And there's already some hints of this, that as the Chinese economy develops, wages slowly but surely are getting pushed up in China. And to the extent that Chinese wages get pushed up because Chinese people have more money and won't work for nothing anymore, some of the poorer countries might now be able to undercut China on labor. But so far we haven't seen a ton of that. And so there's it's just not clear what the recipe is for some countries that are still trying now to develop in the 21st century.